May the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. When I was a boy, there was a picture in the children's encyclopedia that I kept on turning back to. It was an artist's impression of a broad valley. There were canoeists negotiating the rapids, and next to the river there were barges making their way along a narrow canal. On the far side of the canal there was a dual carriageway. There was a pathway with some people, some hikers walking down it. Beyond that, a steam train was happily puffing along. To top this illustration of the various ways of getting from A to B, a helicopter was making its way downriver. As I said, that picture has stuck with me, and so when I came here I was delighted to find that we had every one of those things on the northern boundary of our parish. And the thing that particularly delights me about them is that apart from the daily helicopter, which seems to set off going towards the east, all these things we have can be used by a traveller going back to the West Country, which for me is home. All of them major works of engineering, all of them making possible an escape to the far-remembered hills of Devon. Perhaps the most remarkable is the railway, Brunel's billiard table, as it's called, which manages to traverse hill and fountain, moor and mountain, without any perceptible changes in gradient all the way to Plymouth, making the A4 capable of carrying motor traffic from London to Bath and beyond. That was a great project in its day too. And have you seen the series of locks in the canal near Devizes? We should be proud to have all that on our doorstep. And believe it or not, it all ties in with our reading from Isaiah. The Jews were in exile in the great imperial city of Babylon. Archaeologists have found evidence of great public works in Babylon, including long, broad, beautifully paved avenues that were used not so much for getting people to work as for lavish, ceremonious processions of dignitaries and the images of the great gods of the pantheon. These were avenues for use by gods. Jerusalem, despite its temple and the palace of the king, Jerusalem was a small provincial town in comparison, like Windsor set alongside New York City. What Isaiah is imagining is a great triumphal route, like the ones they were used to in Babylon, a broad avenue being built for Jehovah to lead his people back from captivity into their promised land. Levelling the mountains, raising the plains, making everything flat and accessible. And it's an image that resounds down the ages, the Lord as the shepherd of his people, bringing them back from the exile which had been their punishment, their penalty. It's been paid. They've been forgiven. A better dawn is breaking. I hope you've been on YouTube and seen the second Advent candle being lit. We're using different words for that this year, but in other years we talk about the prophets on this day. So instead of going on to Mark, whom we can talk about next week, let's stick with Isaiah and the exile. Why did the exile happen? Well, it's to the prophets that we turn for an answer, and they tell us that it was unfaithfulness. The holy people of God had been worshipping other gods, the sun, the moon and the stars, Baal and the Queen of Heaven. They'd been sacrificing children to Molech. How could Jehovah not be jealous? No wonder he decided to take vengeance on their fickleness. That's how history is made. Well, that's the account we get from the Bible. But imagine you go back to college and you have to write a long essay on the history of population movement in the Middle East between 1500 and 0 BC. You'll talk about the effects of the eruption of Santorini, earthquakes and tsunamis making coastal plains uninhabitable, so people had to move off to find somewhere else to live. The Trojan War, alliances between nations, the development of sea power and colonization. Trade will feature pretty heavily. War, the impulse to acquire empires. All of that for Greece, Rome, Syria, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, and Persia. All that for those nations. Yet, for one small country, about the size of Cornwall and Devon put together, not sure why you'd want to put Cornwall and Devon put together, but let that pass. That in that country, in that tiny country, and that tiny country alone, the movement of people is down to religious pluralism. In the great scheme of things, how does that work out? Now, I have to be careful here. It's not just a matter of religious sensibilities. The question is complex. But we do have to listen to what a professional historian might want to tell us. The truth is, of course, that Israel was a buffer state surviving as it did uneasily amongst great powers that were jostling for control of the Middle East. Assyria, Egypt, and Babylon were powerful neighbours of the Promised Land. There was no friendship lost between any of them. It would have made sense for military and commercial reasons for Israel to come to arrangements with them. Certainly, trade between them used to thrive. In those days it was entirely unregulated, it just went on. And we know that Israel depended on Egypt for horses and mercenary cavalry. But in this lethal power game of great powers, Israel actually had nothing to offer. No industry, no great agriculture, no prolific mines of silver or gold. Its sole use to Egypt and Assyria was as a buffer zone. As long as Israel kept its neutrality, as long as détente was maintained, neither Assyria or Egypt were able to mass troops on each other's frontier. There was Israel in there between them. And it suited the great powers to have this little oasis of peace there. So was Isaiah wrong? Did the disobedience to Jehovah that he made so much of, did that actually play no part in their fate? Were the prophets just God-botherers who misled the faithful about the inexorable march of history into which they'd get caught up? Well, the subject next week will be John the Baptist, and I'll give you the second half of this sermon then. But I'll make this important point first. There's one message the prophets made which is always overlooked, never taken in its true sense, just goes unregarded. If you had Bibles in your hands, which would be no bad thing, I take you back to Isaiah chapters 6 to 8. The country is about to be invaded. How should they defend themselves? Isaiah is clearly asked by the powers that be, and his advice is, do nothing. The problem will go away. Don't seek to make alliances with Assyria or with Egypt. If you do that, you'll simply make the whole land a battlefield. Stay calm, lie low, the threat will pass. Now, as you know, the Bible is not a pacifist text. Its pages are full of violence and bloodshed, and they seem to glory in it. But when the great nations were on the move, the advice the prophets gave was simple. Don't make eye contact. Stay out of it. There's no shame in wearing camouflage. Think of Psalm 46. The heathen make much ado, and the kingdoms are moved. That's what Psalm 46 is talking about, Assyria and Egypt on the move. The heathen make much ado, and the kingdoms are moved. And God's response is, be still then, and know that I am God. Make yourself look small, lie low, and I will keep you out of danger. Big processes of history are underway. If you try to join in, you'll be crushed. Well, this isn't cowardice on the part of the prophets. It isn't appeasement or craven desire to avoid being hurt. Be still then, and know that I am God. The prophets were telling the people that their role was indeed to be a city of peace. We're told that Jerusalem means that, here Salem, as in Shalom, holy peace. It should be a city of peace. That's what it claims to be. The nations could come into it and see how, despite all the turmoil of the nations around them, the people of this land were protected not by force of arms, but by the protection of their Almighty and their blameless way of life. And that would be the role of Jerusalem in the world. Going on after these wars, the political neutrality of the Jews, not in terms of refusing to defend herself if ever she had to, but in standing aside from the clash of empires. That would preserve Jerusalem. That would keep the Jews holy, safe, and respected for the rest of history. Now, as you see, consideration of what we've read about half a millennium before Christ, consideration of that now goes quite some way to account for how things are in the world today. There is a straight line from Babylon to Auschwitz, but I'm not going there. I want to say more about the role of the prophets in all this and in modern times. For that, next week, same time, same place.